The strangest argument I have ever had with a neighbor started with him standing on my porch, holding a stack of printed Wi-Fi reports like he was about to serve me a court order. He was red in the face, breathing hard, and before I could even say hello, he pointed at me and said, "You need to fix what you broke." I honestly thought he was joking, because the idea that my home Wi-Fi could somehow attack his internet connection sounded like something someone would say after watching too many conspiracy videos online. But he was completely serious, and within 5 minutes, I was being accused of causing his internet problems, ruining his ability to work, and owing him $1,900 in damages. My name is Daniel Carter, and at the time, I lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Asheville, North Carolina, the kind of place where people waved when they drove by and everyone knew which house had the best Christmas lights every December. I had lived there for almost 7 years, kept my yard clean, stayed out of neighborhood drama, and honestly preferred spending my evenings on my back porch with a cup of coffee instead of getting involved in anyone else's problems. My neighbor across the street, however, was different. His name was Greg Holloway, and he had always been the type of person who needed to be right, even when he was clearly wrong. It wasn't that he was a bad person, exactly. But Greg had a habit of turning every small inconvenience into a personal attack. If his trash bin wasn't moved exactly where he wanted it, someone was disrespecting him. If a delivery truck parked too close to his driveway, someone was making his life difficult. He didn't look for solutions first. He looked for someone to blame. The problem started a few weeks after I upgraded my home network. I worked remotely as a software consultant, and after years of dealing with slow internet during video meetings, I finally bought a better router system. Nothing fancy, nothing illegal, just a modern setup that gave me stronger coverage throughout my house. I installed it on a Saturday morning, tested the connection, and went about my life. I had no idea that across the street, Greg had already decided something was wrong. The first time he mentioned it, he caught me while I was taking groceries out of my truck. He walked over with his phone in his hand and said, "Did you change your internet equipment?" I looked at him and said, "Yeah, I upgraded my router last weekend." "Why?" He stared at me like he was waiting for me to confess. "Because ever since then, my Wi-Fi has been cutting out every night." I remember laughing a little, not because I wanted to insult him, but because I genuinely thought he was misunderstanding something. I said, "Greg, my router isn't connected to yours. That's not really how this works." That answer did not satisfy him. He shook his head and said, "That's what people say when they don't want to admit they're causing a problem." I almost didn't know how to respond to that. It was such a strange accusation that my brain needed a second to catch up. I tried explaining that wireless networks operate on different channels, that interference can happen, but one person's router doesn't just reach across the street and knock another person's connection offline. He listened for about 10 seconds before deciding I was being difficult. "Look, Daniel, I'm not asking for a lecture. I'm telling you there's a problem, and the problem started when you changed your equipment." Then he walked away. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days later, I received a call from my internet provider. The representative told me they had received a formal interference complaint connected to my address and that they needed to schedule a technician visit. At first, I actually laughed because I thought there was some mistake, but the employee on the phone explained that they had to investigate any official complaint, regardless of whether it seemed reasonable. When the technician arrived that Friday afternoon, Greg was already outside waiting. He stood near the sidewalk with his arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone who had already won a trial that hadn't even started. "Finally," he said when the technician stepped out of the truck. "I've been dealing with this for weeks." I watched him follow the technician into my house, and I have to admit, there was something almost funny about how seriously he treated my little router sitting on the shelf. He pointed at it like it was a criminal hiding in plain sight. "That's the equipment right there," he said. "That's what's causing everything." The technician, a calm guy named Marcus, didn't argue. He just smiled politely, opened his laptop, and started running tests. I stood there quietly while Greg hovered behind him, clearly waiting for the moment someone would turn around and say, "You're right. Daniel did it." But after several minutes, Marcus looked up and said something that changed the entire mood in the room. "Your network looks completely normal. Signal strength is fine. Channel usage is clean. I'm not seeing any interference coming from your equipment." Greg frowned immediately. "Check again," he said. "It only happens at night." Marcus looked at him, then at me, and calmly replied, "Then let's take a look at your setup too." And that was the moment I realized this wasn't just about Wi-Fi anymore. It was about proving who was right. And Greg had no idea that the answer he wanted was about to come from inside his own house. We walked across the street to Greg's house, and I remember thinking how strange the whole situation had become. A week earlier, this was just a neighbor complaining about slow internet. Now we had a technician, official reports, and two grown adults standing in a driveway waiting to find out whether a piece of technology was guilty or innocent. The funny thing was, Greg still looked completely confident. He wasn't nervous, he wasn't curious, and he definitely wasn't questioning his own theory. In his mind, we were simply going through the steps before everyone admitted he was right. As Marcus stepped inside his house, Greg immediately started explaining the story again, almost like he was giving a closing argument in court. Every night around dinner time, it happens, he said. The connection drops. My work freezes, and then I look outside and I see Daniel's lights on. You can't tell me that's a coincidence. I looked at Marcus because I honestly didn't know whether to laugh or defend myself. The thing about arguments like this is that sometimes the hardest part isn't proving someone wrong. It's accepting that they were so confident while being wrong. Marcus just nodded and said, "Let's check the equipment first." That sentence alone seemed to bother Greg because he wanted someone to agree with him, not investigate. But Marcus wasn't there to pick sides. He was there to find facts. He started by looking at Greg's router location, and within seconds, I saw his expression change. It wasn't the look of someone finding a complicated technical issue. It was the look of someone discovering a very simple mistake that had been sitting there the whole time. Greg's router was shoved behind a large metal filing cabinet in his office. Not beside it, not near it, behind it, like someone had intentionally hidden it there. Next to that filing cabinet was a microwave sitting on a small shelf. I remember looking at it and thinking, there is no way this is what we're here for. But apparently, it was exactly what we were there for. Marcus crouched down, moved the router slightly, and checked the cables. One of the coax cables was old, cracked, and had visible corrosion around the connection points. He looked back at Greg and asked, "How long has this equipment been set up like this?" Greg shrugged. "I don't know. A few years maybe, but that doesn't matter." Problem started when Daniel changed his router. Marcus didn't argue. He just pointed toward the microwave. "Actually, this matters a lot." Greg looked confused. "The microwave?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, the location of your router is a major issue. You have a wireless device sitting behind a metal barrier, right beside an appliance that can create interference. When you run this microwave, especially during peak evening hours, it can disrupt your connection." Greg stared at him like he was waiting for the punchline. "You're saying my microwave is breaking my internet?" Marcus smiled slightly and said, "I'm saying your router placement and your equipment condition are causing the problem you're blaming on your neighbor." I don't think Greg expected that answer. For the first time since this whole thing started, he didn't immediately have a response. He walked over to the microwave, then back to the router, almost like physically looking at them would somehow change the facts. "But why does it happen when his lights are on?" he asked. And honestly, that was probably the most revealing part of the entire situation. Greg had built a connection between two unrelated events because he was looking for a person, not a problem. Marcus opened his laptop again and pulled up the router logs. He compared the times of the connection drops with the times the microwave was being used. Within minutes, the pattern was obvious. Every evening when the internet failed, the microwave activity matched almost perfectly. The evidence wasn't complicated. It wasn't hidden. It was right there in the data. Marcus showed Greg the results and explained everything step by step. But I could tell Greg wasn't really listening anymore. His entire argument had been built around one assumption, and that assumption had just collapsed. I stood there watching him process it, and part of me almost felt bad. Almost. Because the truth was, Greg hadn't just made a mistake. He had accused me publicly, filed a complaint, and demanded $1,800 from me because he was too stubborn to consider another possibility. Marcus finished documenting everything. He took pictures of the equipment set up, recorded his findings, and confirmed that my network had nothing to do with the issue. Then he turned to Greg and said something that made the room go completely quiet. "Since this wasn't a network fault on Daniel's side, you'll be responsible for the service visit fee. Also, submitting false interference complaints can lead to penalties if there's a pattern of misuse." Greg's face changed immediately. The confidence was gone. The frustration was gone. What was left was embarrassment. He tried to soften the situation by saying, "Well, I was just trying to protect my work." And maybe part of him really believed that. But protecting yourself doesn't mean blaming someone else without evidence. After Marcus left, Greg didn't apologize. Not right away. He didn't knock on my door and say, "Hey, I was wrong." Instead, he stayed quiet. For the next several days, things between us became awkward. We used to wave when we passed each other. We used to exchange quick conversations about the weather or neighborhood updates. Now he avoided eye contact every time I saw him. And honestly, that bothered me more than the accusation itself, because the whole situation had started over something so small, but it revealed something much bigger. Sometimes people don't want the truth. Sometimes they want a target. Greg wanted the easiest explanation, the closest person to blame, and the story where he was the victim. The problem was, facts don't care about someone's pride. A few days later, I saw him standing outside his mailbox holding an envelope from the internet company. He opened it, looked at the paper inside, and his entire expression changed. I didn't know what the bill said, and I didn't need to. I already knew the lesson. When you accuse someone without proof, sometimes the hardest part isn't admitting you were wrong. It's realizing everyone else saw it before you did. But what happened after that envelope arrived was something I never expected, because Greg wasn't finished with the situation yet. For the next several weeks, I expected Greg to eventually come over and say something. Maybe not a huge apology, maybe not some dramatic speech where he admitted he was wrong, but at least something simple like, "Hey Daniel." I jumped to conclusions, because honestly, that's what I would have done if I accused someone of something, filed a complaint against them, and then discovered I was completely wrong. I would feel obligated to make things right, but Greg never did. And the longer he stayed silent, the more I realized that the Wi-Fi issue had never really been about the Wi-Fi. The router, the interference, the technician's report, those were just the surface details. The real problem was something much more common: pride. Greg had spent so much energy convincing himself that he had found the person responsible that admitting he was wrong would mean admitting he had created the entire conflict himself. And for some people, that's a harder thing to accept than the original problem. I noticed the change almost immediately. Before all this happened, Greg and I weren't best friends, but we were friendly enough. We would wave when we saw each other outside. Sometimes we would talk about the weather, complain about rising utility bills, or joke about how every year the neighborhood seemed to get busier. He was the kind of neighbor you could have a quick 5-minute conversation with while checking the mail. But after the technician left his house that afternoon, everything changed. The casual conversations disappeared. The quick waves stopped. If we happened to be outside at the same time, Greg suddenly became very interested in whatever was happening on his phone. It was almost funny because the man who had been so confident standing on my porch with his printed evidence now couldn't even look me in the eye. And I'll admit something, part of me enjoyed seeing that, not because I wanted him embarrassed, but because for once, the person who had been so certain about blaming someone else had to sit with the consequences of being wrong. A few days after the inspection, I found the technician's report sitting in my email inbox. I opened it again, even though I already knew what it said. Sometimes when something stressful happens, you need to see the proof one more time just to remind yourself that you weren't imagining things. The report clearly explained that my equipment was operating normally. There was no interference coming from my home, and the issue was caused by problems within Greg's own setup. It was all there in black and white. No arguments, no opinions, no emotions, just facts. And that was probably the thing that bothered Greg the most. Facts don't care how confident someone sounds. They don't care who complains louder, who gets angry first, or who acts like they have already won. Eventually, the truth has a way of showing up. About a week later, I was sitting in my home office when I noticed Greg outside near his mailbox. He had just received a letter, and from the look on his face, I could tell he already knew what it was. He opened the envelope slowly, scanned the page, and his expression changed. His shoulders dropped a little, his jaw tightened. He stood there for a few seconds just staring at the paper. I couldn't hear what he said, and I didn't need to. I knew he was reading the final reminder about the service charge and the consequences of filing a complaint that turned out to have no evidence behind it. I watched him fold the paper and walk back inside, and strangely enough, I didn't feel angry anymore. I actually felt a little sorry for him, because somewhere along the way, Greg had convinced himself that being wrong was the same as losing. But admitting you were wrong isn't losing. It's actually one of the hardest forms of maturity. The problem is, not everyone learns that lesson. A month later, I ran into him at a local hardware store. We were both standing near the outdoor tools section, and for a second, neither of us knew what to say. It was one of those awkward moments where two people who used to casually talk suddenly become strangers. Finally, Greg looked at me and said, "The internet issue is fixed." I nodded and said, "Good. I'm glad you figured it out." He looked like he wanted to say more, but he stopped himself. There was a pause, a long one. Then he just said, "Yeah, turns out it wasn't your router." I almost smiled because that was probably the closest thing to an apology I was ever going to get from him. I didn't push him. I didn't remind him about the $1,800 accusation. I didn't bring up the complaint or the way he had stood on my porch acting like he had already proven I was guilty. Sometimes, the best response is letting someone sit with their own realization. After that day, things slowly became normal again. Not exactly like before, but better. We weren't suddenly friends, and we never talked about the incident in detail again, but the tension faded. Every once in a while, we would wave from our driveways. Small conversations came back. The neighborhood went back to being quiet. And maybe that's the biggest lesson I took from the whole experience. Technology changes. Equipment breaks. Mistakes happen. But the way people handle those moments says a lot about who they are. A problem can either become a conversation, or it can become a battle. Greg chose the battle first. He wanted someone responsible before he understood the situation. He wanted a villain before he looked for the truth. And for a while, I think he believed confidence could replace evidence. But it can't. At the end of the day, I didn't win because Greg lost. I won because I stayed calm. I trusted the facts, and I refused to let someone else's assumption become my reality. I learned that you don't always have to fight harder. Sometimes you just have to let the truth do the work for you. So now I want to hear what you think. Was Greg just a frustrated homeowner who made a mistake under pressure? Or did he go too far by accusing his neighbor, filing a complaint, and demanding money before knowing the facts? Have you ever dealt with someone who was completely convinced they were right, only to discover they had blamed the wrong person the entire time? Tell me your story in the comments, because these everyday conflicts often reveal more about people than the big dramatic moments do. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and share with someone who believes that sometimes the strongest response isn't yelling louder, it's simply having the evidence on your side.